National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Service on Celluloid is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Herstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode where I will answer comments and questions from the previous episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1987 film Empire of the Sun. The film focuses on the times of a privileged young British boy named Jamie, who was born and raised in Shanghai. The film begins as the Japanese invade and conquer Shanghai and send the thousands of foreign nationals living in the city to an internment camp. It's here that we follow Jamie's life as he comes of age in the Japanese-run internment camp from 1941 until the end of the war. Empire of the Sun stars Christian Bale, John Malkovich, and Miranda Richardson. The film was directed by Steven Spielberg. It was a critical success but was considered a financial flop. Empire was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, winning none of them.
The other thing, I remember sailing into the harbor, and we went into San Pedro in Long Beach, California, and they had a band on the dock. I'd never heard the Star Spangled Banner, ever, until then. And we all wept. Everybody wept. And I weep now. Hey, I'm an American. It's the best thing in the world to be. Absolutely, hands down.
That was the voice of former American civilian internee Howard Hart. Howard was a young boy who was liberated by American paratroopers from the civilian internment camp of Los Baños in the Philippines in 1945. We'll hear more from and about Howard later on. A little better than half of Empire of the Sun is set in the Japanese civilian internment camp of Lunghua in Shanghai. In the film, we see that the internees were treated fairly by their captors, enjoying an almost carefree lifestyle, having access to food, medical treatment, and luxuries such as regular baths and soft beds. The reality of internment by the Japanese was much different than what the movie showed, though. There were some Americans interned in Lunghua, but there were far more that were interned in the Philippines. The story of civilian internment, at least for the Americans, people of the United States, has a much stronger base there than in China. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. The Philippine Islands was a popular destination for American civilians in the late 1930s. Not quite as popular as Hawaii, but it was still very popular. Business opportunities and religious missions were generally the reasons many American citizens moved to the Philippines. When the Japanese invaded in 1941, the vast majority of those American civilians became stranded and thereby became prisoners of the Japanese. Admittedly, the civilians were not treated nearly as harshly as were their fellow countrymen who were in the military, who were in uniform. But nevertheless, civilian internees of the Japanese in the Philippines certainly did not live the life portrayed in the Empire of the Sun. The privations of internee life were many. Food was always in short supply, always, as were medical supplies and proper shelter. Being prisoners of the Japanese also lent itself to physical abuse, such as beatings, torture, and outright murder. And this is really no different, really, than your military prisoners of war, with the exception of the fact that it didn't happen as often to the civilians as it did to the military. I was reading yesterday, as a matter of fact, that an astonishing 45%, when we're talking about American prisoners of war at the hands of the Japanese, an astonishing 45% of Americans who were captured by the Japanese in the Pacific never returned home, meaning they were either died in captivity or were executed by the Japanese, as opposed to 1% who died at the hands of the Germans. There were several civilian internee camps in the Philippines, but one of the larger ones was at a place called Los Baños. Established in December 1942 by the Japanese, the camp held over 2,000 internees, of which over 1,500 were American civilians. A lot of these people, too, not 1,500 of them, but a lot of them were nuns, Catholic nuns and priests who were there as missionaries, as I'd said earlier. Conditions in the camp were rough, to say the least. Food was generally a dream. By 1945, the daily rations for the internees consisted of water and a few pieces of bread, if they were lucky. These people would eat bugs. They'd eat, mice if they could catch them. Whatever they could get their hands on, they would eat. Disease, and as a result of that, disease was rampant in the camp. Many of the internees were deathly ill and were wasting away by 1945. Following the American landings in the Philippines in 44 and 45, October 44 to be exact, and the landings kept going as the Americans proceeded up the Philippine chain, which is the largest chain of islands in the Pacific. Many former internees who had escaped the camps reported to American troops the disintegrating state of the internees' health and well-being. As American forces moved through the Philippines, POW camps and internee camps were liberated at places like Cabanatuan, Bilibid, and Santo Tomas. Cabanatuan is probably the most famous of all of them, honestly. This is where the 6th Ranger Battalion, led by a gentleman named Captain Robert Prince, infiltrated into the Cabanatuan prison camp, executed a perfect nighttime raid on the camp, and liberated American prisoners of war who were survivors of the Bataan Death March and other places, but mostly Philippine campaign prisoners of war that were taken in 41 and 42. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, only one person died in that raid, one ranger, and I think one prisoner did eventually die. He was wounded in the firefight, and he eventually died later on. So it was extremely, extremely successful. And because of the success of Cabanatuan and Bilibid and Santo Tomas, which was a civilian internee camp, the thought of raiding these camps and getting these people out of here was it was bolstered by the success that the Americans had enjoyed earlier. These raids were mainly done through daring behind-the-line covert ops. The reasons for these special missions were many, not the least of which was the fear of Japanese reprisals. The Japanese knew, obviously, that the Americans were in the Philippines. They knew that their time was limited. And as a result, they were going to take out their aggressions and their misfortune, if you will, on the prisoners in which they had in their hands. If you've listened to any of the other podcasts, you remember the one that we talked about, Bataan, and I mentioned the execution of the American prisoners at Palawan. And this was done as the Americans were moving up the chain in 44 and 45. So incidences such as the Palawan massacre influenced the American military to stage these raids and get these people out of here. With the aforementioned camps of Cabanatuan, Bilibid, and Santo Tomas being liberated, and the prisoners safely in American hands, Los Baños with its civilian prisoners lay in the sights of the American liberators as one of the last ones. This raid would be another daring four-pronged operation. This time combining airborne operations, one of the few times airborne forces were used in the Pacific, and a seaward landing via Amtrak across Laguna de Bay. Airborne forces from the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, along with engineers and a field artillery battalion, would drop just outside the camp and, with the aid of local guerrillas, eliminate the Japanese garrison in and around the camp. At the same time, a blocking force would attempt to block the advance of any Japanese reinforcements, of which they knew there was about 8 to 10,000, only about 10 miles away from Los Baños at the time. It was an element of what the Americans called the Tiger Division, the Japanese Tiger Division. As I said, the blocking force would attempt to block this unit from getting to Los Baños. All the while, an amphibious force would cross Laguna de Bay in LVTs and bring the prisoners back across the bay to safety. The LVT, of course, is what I mentioned earlier, is the Amtrak. It's an amphibious tractor. You see, if you look at pictures of the operation, the Invasion of Taro, really any operation in the Pacific at all, you'll see these things. They're pretty unique vehicles. One of these paratroopers was a young man named Philip Schweitzer. The Brooklyn native joined the Army in 1943, volunteering for service in the airborne. He saw heavy action through the Philippines, earning a Bronze Star with V for Valor, among other decorations. It was his role in the liberation of Los Baños, however, that stuck with him the most. Let's hear what Mr. Schweitzer has to say about the raid on Los Baños.
So then the next day before we were supposed to go, he said that there's a prison camp at Los Baños, which is 25 miles behind the lines. We're supposed to go in and bring out the prisoners. He said, we have found out from a prisoner who escaped from the camp that every morning at 7 o'clock, the Japanese are out doing calisthenics. And most of the guards are there, and their arms are stacked. And so they they had a pretty good plan for it. MacArthur had orders in to rescue those prisoners. So came dawn, we parachuted in, and luckily we got in and we got to the stacks of arms before the guards did. And As far as we know, as far as we knew at that time, all the Japanese had been dispatched. We couldn't take prisoners because we had nothing to do with them. At the same time, when we were flying over, the night before, because this was on the far side of what they call Laguna de Bay, on the far side of the bay, they came over with these Amtraks from the, I think it was the 657th Amtrak Battalion. And they landed, and then they had some troops in there who set up a perimeter around the landing zone, and then they moved on into the camp. So once we had secured the camp, we called them, and they came on in, and these were to take the prisoners out. We were very, very lucky because with all the firing and everything that was going on, the prisoners, smartly enough, stayed in their barracks and were low, but with all the shooting going on, not a one of them was wounded or injured or anything. Somebody had to be looking over us at that day. Most of these internees, well, you see 6-foot men weighing about 90 pounds. Women, the same way, very emaciated. I mean, they were living on practically no rations at all. They were eating bugs, worms, whatever. They had nothing to speak of. They were rationed with water. Once a day they could get water for the most part. And they were, I mean, they were so pathetic to look at. I mean, some of them couldn't even walk. I mean, a lot of them had to be carried to the Amtraks, be put into the Amtraks. They couldn't walk at all. Families were separated because when the attack started, they just ran to wherever they could out of safety. So a lot of them were running around like crazy trying to unite, and we're trying to tell them, don't worry about it. You can get to meet the rest of your family when you get where you're going, but we got to get you out of here. We got to move you. We got to get you going. To see people in that condition, it's just hard to describe. It's just hard to describe. You see pictures sometimes, you know, of it, but it's awfully difficult to describe it.
While the great majority of prisoners at Los Baños were adults, there were also many children. Children ranging in ages from teenagers to newborns. Philip Schweitzer recalled that he saw another paratrooper carrying a newborn baby out of Los Baños in his helmet. Many of the children prisoners knew nothing of the outside world because, I mean, he's, you know, talking about kids who were 4, 5, 6 years old who were captured by the Japanese when they were, 1 or 2. One of those children was a 5-year-old boy named Howard Hart. Howard's parents had been in the Philippines in 1941, and like many of his fellow countrymen, Howard had become a prisoner of the Japanese at the ripe age of 2 in 1942. Early on the morning of February 23, 1945, young Howard witnessed the liberation of Los Baños. His liberation would set into motion a calling of which he would fulfill for the rest of his life. Let's listen to Howard's memories of Los Baños.
So, at 7 o'clock in the morning, DC-3s, C-47s arrive overhead. Americans start jumping out, paratroopers. Guerrillas start opening fire on these guys. And at the same time, a whole bunch of Amtraks are clanking across Laguna de Bay because we had to be taken out right away because of the presence of a 10,000-man Japanese division all around the Los Baños area. The Amtraks, traveling at night with nothing but hand compasses, made it 12 miles across Laguna de Bay in the absolute black darkness and hit the beach just as the paratroopers and the guerrillas had cleared the camp and trundled up into the camp and started loading prisoners on board and taking them back out and back into the water again, back to the American side. One of the most important things to happen in my life was, and the question is, why did I wind up working first for the United States government at all, and then secondly in the Central Intelligence Agency? A paratrooper picked me up and put me under his arm, and in his other hand, his other arm, he had a Tommy gun. And he started jogging down towards the beach where the Amtraks, some of the Amtraks were. This paratrooper put me under his arm and started jogging me down, and it was 1.5 miles or so to the beach. And he kept saying, "I'm going to take you home, kid." I'm going to take you home. And my country saved my life, and I owed them a life back. Pure and simple. To have, as a child, I only knew from that moment on that somehow I had to be that paratrooper. My turn would come. I would grow up, and I would have to be that guy. I never was. And I could never repay that debt if I had 50 lifetimes. But you try.
Despite what he says in his oral history clip, Howard Hart would certainly repay that debt. As you heard in his clip, Howard served in the CIA. He joined in 1965, and he served his country in the CIA for over 35 years, serving as station chief in Islamabad, Iran, and Germany. He played an enormous part in supplying the Afghans with weapons to fight the Soviets in the 1980s, and he was the chief architect of the covert operation to rescue American hostages in Iran in the 1980s, unfortunately an operation that did fail. If you read anything about that operation, you'll know it was a covert op using helicopters to come in, theoretically, to use helicopters to come in the middle of the night, burst into the camp, and retrieve the American hostages. And this is something that surely was inspired by the rescue mission that he was a part of in 1945. Named a trailblazer by the CIA and one of the most influential agents in its history, Hart received the CIA's highest award for service and gallantry an astonishing 3 times. The raid on Los Baños, actually all of the American staged covert raids on Philippine POW or internee camps, were marvelous successes, as I'd said earlier. The actions of the troops involved in the raids, specifically the 6th Ranger Battalion at Cabanatuan and the 11th Airborne Division at Los Baños, saved thousands of American lives from torture, disease, starvation, and execution at the hands of their captors. So with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week when we discuss the 1970 film Patton. If you'd like to listen to the oral histories featured here today, please visit our digital collections at ww2online.org. That's www2online.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.